Sarah Martinez looked like any other young woman working the late shift at the downtown diner. Her gentle smile served coffee to truck drivers and night workers. Her soft voice took orders with patience, and her small frame moved quietly between tables. The regulars knew her as the kind girl who always remembered how they liked their eggs and never complained about difficult customers. But what they didn't know was that just 18 months earlier, those same gentle hands had been trained to kill in 12 different ways. That soft voice had once commanded respect from some of the military's toughest soldiers. And that small frame had endured training so brutal that 90% of candidates never made it through. Marcus Thompson thought he knew exactly who he was dealing with when he started his campaign of harassment. He saw an easy target, a quiet waitress working alone during the dangerous hours between midnight and dawn. He had no idea that beneath her civilian clothes lived the heart of a warrior who had sworn an oath to protect the innocent, no matter the cost. This is the story of what happens when a predator chooses the wrong prey, when someone mistakes kindness for weakness, and when a decorated Navy SEAL decides that some lines should never be crossed. It all started on a rainy Tuesday night in October, when Sarah was just trying to live a normal life. Sarah Martinez wiped down the counter for the third time that hour, her movements automatic and precise. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's Diner cast harsh shadows across the empty booths, and the rain drummed steadily against the windows. It was nearly 2 in the morning, and the usual late-night crowd had thinned to just a few regulars nursing their coffee and trying to make it last until dawn. She had been working at Murphy's for 8 months now, ever since she moved to the small town of Cedar Falls. The transition from military life to civilian work had been harder than she expected. After 12 years in the Navy, including 6 years with the SEALs, the quiet routine of small-town life felt strange. But that was exactly what she needed: normal, peaceful, forgettable. The bell above the door chimed, and Sarah looked up to see a man she didn't recognize sliding into the corner booth. He was tall and broad-shouldered, probably in his mid-30s, with the kind of confident swagger that suggested he was used to getting his way. His clothes were expensive, designer jeans, and a leather jacket that probably cost more than Sarah made in 2 months. "Coffee?" she asked, approaching his table with the pot in hand. He looked her up and down slowly, his eyes lingering in ways that made her skin crawl. "Coffee sounds good, sweetheart, but I think I'd rather have something sweeter." Sarah kept her expression neutral, though every instinct she had developed during her military training was suddenly on high alert. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but something about this man felt different. Dangerous. "Coffee it is," she said firmly, filling his cup and moving to step away. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. "Hey now, don't be so unfriendly. I'm Marcus Thompson. I own half the businesses in this town. I could make things very good for you, if you're nice to me." Sarah looked down at his hand on her wrist. In her former life, grabbing her like that would have resulted in a broken arm and a trip to the hospital. But she wasn't that person anymore. She was just Sarah, the quiet waitress who wanted nothing more than to live a normal life. "Please let go," she said calmly. Marcus smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. "Or what? You'll call the cops?" "Sheriff Peterson and I go way back. He won't do anything to upset one of the town's biggest contributors." Sarah could feel the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before combat, but she forced herself to breathe slowly. She had left that life behind for a reason. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the constant state of readiness for violence. She had worked hard to put it all in the past. "Please," she said again, her voice steady but with an edge that Marcus was too arrogant to notice. He released her wrist and leaned back in his booth. "That's better. Now, why don't you tell me when you get off work? I got a nice car outside, and we could go for a drive." "I'm not interested," Sarah replied, taking a step back. Marcus's expression darkened. "You know, sweetheart, this is a small town. People talk. And right now, they're saying nice things about the new girl who works hard and keeps to herself. But that could change real quick if someone started spreading different stories." The threat was clear, and Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had seen men like Marcus before, predators who used their power and position to hurt others. The difference was that in her previous life, she had been authorized to deal with such threats permanently. Here, she was just a civilian trying to make an honest living. "I need to get back to work," she said, turning away. "This conversation isn't over," Marcus called after her. Sarah returned to the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she set down the coffee pot. The other customers in the diner seemed oblivious to what had just happened, lost in their own late-night thoughts. She glanced at the clock, still 3 hours until her shift ended, and the morning crew arrived. Marcus stayed for another hour, making increasingly crude comments and suggestions every time she passed his table. He left a $20 tip on a $4 bill, along with a napkin that had his phone number and a message written in crude block letters, "Call me or else." After he left, Sarah tried to focus on her work, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Men like Marcus didn't take rejection well, and his comment about the sheriff suggested he had the kind of connections that could make her life very difficult. When her shift finally ended at 6 in the morning, Sarah walked to her small apartment on the edge of town. It was a modest place, just a one-bedroom unit above an old hardware store, but it was hers, and it was peaceful. She had chosen it specifically because it was quiet and out of the way. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she noticed a figure sitting in a car across the street. Even in the early morning light, she could see it was Marcus, watching her building with the patience of a hunter. He made no effort to hide his presence. In fact, he seemed to want her to know he was there. Sarah closed her door and locked it, then checked the secondary lock she had installed when she moved in. Old habits died hard, and despite her desire for a normal life, she had never been able to completely let down her guard. Now she was grateful for that paranoia. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at her small kitchen table, trying to process what had happened. In Afghanistan, Iraq, and a dozen other places she couldn't talk about, she had faced down terrorists, enemy soldiers, and some of the most dangerous people in the world. But this felt different. This wasn't combat. This was civilian life with civilian rules, and she wasn't sure how to handle a threat she couldn't simply eliminate. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The number on the display was unknown, but somehow she knew who it would be. "Hello, sweetheart." Marcus's voice was smooth and confident. "I hope you're thinking about my offer. How did you get this number?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. "I told you, I have connections in this town. There's not much I can't find out if I want to. For instance, I know you moved here 8 months ago from San Diego. I know you don't have any family or friends here. I know you keep to yourself and don't cause trouble. The question is, are you smart enough to keep it that way?" Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her situation settling on her shoulders. "What do you want?" "I think you know what I want. The question is whether you're going to make this easy or hard. Because I always get what I want in the end. And if I refuse..." Marcus chuckled. "Well, that would be unfortunate. See, I've got friends at the bank where you have your account. I got friends at the electric company, the phone company, the apartment management. I've got friends everywhere that matters. Things could get very difficult for you very quickly." Sarah felt a familiar rage building in her chest, the same cold fury that had made her so effective in combat. But she forced herself to stay calm. "I see. I knew you were smart. So here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow night, you're going to get off work, and you're going to come to my house. We'll have dinner, get to know each other better. And if you're as nice as I think you can be, maybe we can work out an arrangement that benefits us both. And if I don't, then you'll find out just how hard life can be for someone with no friends in a small town. Trust me, sweetheart, you don't want to test me on this." The line went dead, and Sarah sat in the silence of her apartment, staring at the phone. She had faced down enemy combatants in the mountains of Afghanistan, had participated in operations that would never appear in any official record, had been trained to handle threats that most people couldn't even imagine. But this was different. This was her new life, her attempt at normalcy, and she didn't know how to protect it without destroying everything she had worked to build. Outside, she could hear Marcus's car starting up and driving away. But she knew he would be back. Men like him always came back, and they always escalated until they got what they wanted or until someone stopped them. Sarah made herself another cup of tea and tried to think. She had options. She always had options. She could disappear again, start over in another town with another identity. She had done it before. Or she could reach out to some of her old contacts, people who specialized in making problems disappear permanently. But both of those choices meant giving up on the life she had tried so hard to build. It meant admitting that she could never really escape what she had been, that there was no such thing as a normal life for someone like her. As the sun rose over Cedar Falls, Sarah Martinez sat at her kitchen table and tried to decide who she was going to be. The quiet waitress who just wanted to be left alone, or the warrior who had never backed down from a fight. She had a feeling that Marcus Thompson was about to find out which choice she made. The decision, she realized, might not be entirely up to her. Some people wouldn't take no for an answer, no matter how much you wanted to live in peace. And when those people pushed too hard, sometimes the only choice was to push back with everything you had. Sarah finished her tea and went to her bedroom closet. Behind the civilian clothes and normal belongings was a small lockbox she had hoped she would never need to open again. Inside were items from her former life, documents, contact information, and other things that could be very useful if a situation required more than just civilian solutions. She didn't open the box that morning, but she left her hand resting on it for a long moment, just in case. The next day brought no relief. Sarah woke to find her car's tires slashed and a note tucked under her windshield wiper. Hope you're thinking about our dinner date. M, standing in the apartment building's parking lot in her waitress uniform. Sarah felt the familiar weight of being hunted. It was a sensation she remembered from her deployment days, the constant awareness that someone dangerous was watching, planning, waiting for the right moment to strike. The difference was that in combat zones, she had been armed, trained, and surrounded by a team of equally lethal professionals. Here, she was supposed to be just another civilian. Sarah called her manager at Murphy's Diner to explain she would be late. Then, she walked the 12 blocks to work, taking a route that allowed her to check for surveillance while appearing to simply be taking in the morning air. She spotted Marcus's distinctive black BMW twice, always staying just far enough back to maintain plausible deniability. The walk gave her time to think. In the military, she had been trained to assess threats and respond accordingly. Marcus Thompson was clearly escalating, moving from verbal intimidation to property damage. The pattern was classic predator behavior, testing boundaries, applying pressure, building towards something more serious. Murphy's Diner felt different when she arrived for her shift. The other employees seemed to avoid eye contact, and her manager, Bill Murphy, was unusually brusque when he handed her the schedule. "Everything okay, Bill?" Sarah asked. The older man shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Sarah, you're a good worker, but I've been hearing things. People are saying you might be trouble, that you're getting involved with the wrong crowd." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What people? Bill wouldn't meet her eyes. Important people. People who matter in this town. Maybe you should think about whether this job is really the right fit for you. The message was clear. Marcus's influence was already spreading, poisoning her relationships before she even had a chance to defend herself. It was a sophisticated form of psychological warfare, and Sarah recognized it immediately. Isolate the target, cut off their support systems, make them feel helpless and alone. Then move in for the kill. Her shift that day was miserable. Regular customers who usually chatted with her now avoided her table. The other waitstaff whispered among themselves when they thought she wasn't looking. Even the cook, a gruff ex-Marine named Tommy who had always been friendly, seemed distant and suspicious. Around 4 in the afternoon, Sheriff Peterson walked in. He was a large man in his 50s with the soft belly and tired eyes of someone who had settled into a comfortable routine. He took a seat at the counter and ordered coffee, then waited until Sarah was the only one within earshot. "You're the new girl, right?" Sarah Martinez. Yes, sir. Peterson studied her for a moment. I've been hearing your name a lot lately. Some folks are saying you might be causing problems for upstanding citizens. Sarah kept her voice level. I'm just trying to do my job and mind my own business, Sheriff. That's good to hear. See, we like things quiet in Cedar Falls. We don't need outside troublemakers coming in and disrupting the peace. You understand what I'm saying? The threat was subtle but clear. Sarah nodded. I understand perfectly. Good. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings that might require official intervention. Peterson left without finishing his coffee, but the message had been delivered. Marcus had the local law enforcement in his pocket, which meant Sarah was truly on her own. That evening, as her shift was ending, Sarah saw Marcus's BMW pull into the parking lot. Her hands moved automatically to check the knife she always carried, a habit from her military days that had never faded. But a knife wouldn't solve this problem. It would only create new ones. Marcus walked into the diner like he owned it, which, given his apparent influence, he might as well have. He sat in the same corner booth as before and waited until the last customer had left before speaking. So, sweetheart, have you thought about our dinner plans? I told you I'm not interested. Marcus smiled, but his eyes remained cold. You know, I've been doing some research on you. Sarah Martinez from San Diego. Except there's no record of a Sarah Martinez living in San Diego before you showed up here. In fact, there's no record of you anywhere before 8 months ago. That's interesting. Sarah felt ice forming in her veins. If Marcus was digging into her background, he might eventually stumble onto something that would blow her cover completely. The documents that established her civilian identity were good, but they weren't perfect. Deep enough investigation by someone with the right connections could uncover inconsistencies. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think you do. See, I'm starting to wonder if maybe you're running from something. Or someone. Which means you might need a friend in this town more than you realize. Sarah began wiping down tables, using the mundane task to mask her growing anxiety. I just want to be left alone. Marcus stood up and walked over to where she was cleaning. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a predator closing in on wounded prey. But that's the thing about small towns, sweetheart. Nobody gets left alone. Everyone knows everyone else's business. Everyone looks out for each other. And everyone knows who their friends are. He reached out and touched her shoulder. Sarah's training screamed at her to break his wrist and put him on the ground, but she forced herself to simply step away. Don't touch me. Or what? You'll call the police. Marcus laughed. Sheriff Peterson, and I had a nice chat about you today. He's concerned that you might be the kind of person who makes false accusations against respected members of the community. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could disappear tonight, pack her few belongings, and vanish into the network of safe houses and hidden identities she had access to through her former life. But that felt too much like running, and she had never been good at running from a fight. What do you want? She asked. I want you to stop playing hard to get. I want you to accept that I'm offering you something good. My protection, my friendship. Maybe even more if you play your cards right. All you have to do is be nice to me. And if I refuse, Marcus's smile disappeared. Then, tomorrow you'll find out that your apartment lease has been terminated due to noise complaints. The day after that, you'll find out that your work visa has some problems that need to be sorted out by immigration officials. The day after that, well, who knows? Bad things happen to people who don't have friends to look out for them. Sarah realized she was trapped in a situation that her military training hadn't prepared her for. This wasn't a clear enemy that could be engaged and eliminated. This was a complex web of civilian power and influence that operated by different rules. Rules she didn't fully understand. I need time to think, she said. Sure, sweetheart. Take all the time you need. But don't take too long. My patience isn't unlimited. Marcus left the diner, but not before making a show of checking his expensive watch. Oh, and Sarah, you might want to walk home a different way tonight. I hear there have been some muggings lately on your usual route. After he was gone, Sarah finished her closing duties in a daze. The threat was escalating faster than she had expected. Marcus wasn't just interested in harassing her. He was systematically dismantling her life piece by piece, forcing her into a corner where she would have no choice but to comply with his demands. The walk home was nerve-wracking. Every shadow could hide an attacker. Every sound could signal danger. Sarah's training had her constantly scanning for threats, checking exit routes, assessing potential weapons in her environment. It was exhausting to maintain that level of alertness in what was supposed to be civilian life. She made it to her apartment without incident, but as she climbed the stairs, she noticed her door was slightly ajar. Her blood froze. She always locked her door, always checked it twice. Someone had been inside. Sarah approached the door carefully, using techniques she had learned for clearing potentially hostile buildings. The apartment was empty, but it had clearly been searched. Drawers had been opened and carefully closed, closets had been examined, and her few personal belongings had been moved and replaced. On her bed was a dozen red roses with a note. Looking forward to getting to know you better. Sweet dreams. M. Sarah sank into her chair, feeling the walls closing in around her. Marcus had violated her personal space, invaded her sanctuary, demonstrated that nowhere was safe from his reach. It was psychological warfare at its most effective, designed to make the target feel helpless, isolated, and completely under the attacker's control. But as Sarah sat in her violated apartment, holding the threatening note, she felt something shifting inside her. The scared civilian who just wanted to be left alone was giving way to something harder, colder, more dangerous. She had spent too many years as a warrior to completely suppress those instincts, and Marcus Thompson was awakening something that had been sleeping. Sarah went to her closet and opened the lockbox for the first time since moving to Cedar Falls. Inside were items from her former life. Secure communication devices, contact information for people who specialized in problems that couldn't be solved through normal channels, and documentation that could establish new identities anywhere in the world. She picked up one of the communication devices and turned it on for the first time in months. Within minutes, she had secure contact with a network of former special operations personnel who had transitioned to civilian life but maintained connections to their old world. The conversation was brief and conducted in the kind of coded language that would sound like innocent small talk to anyone listening in. But the message was clear. Sarah Martinez was calling in old debts and requesting assistance with a problem that required specialized skills. By dawn, help would be on the way. But more importantly, Sarah had made a decision about who she was going to be. Marcus Thompson thought he was hunting a helpless waitress. He had no idea that he had actually cornered one of the most dangerous people he could have possibly chosen as a target. The scared civilian was gone. In her place was Petty Officer First Class Sarah Martinez, United States Navy SEALs, and she was done running from bullies. As she prepared for what was coming, Sarah felt a familiar calm settling over her. It was the same feeling she had experienced before every mission, the certainty that came from having a clear objective and the skills necessary to accomplish it. Marcus Thompson wanted to play games with people's lives. Sarah was about to teach him that some games had deadly consequences. The war was about to begin, and Marcus had no idea what he had started. Jake Morrison arrived in Cedar Falls on a Greyhound bus at dawn, carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag and the kind of easy smile that made people trust him instantly. To anyone watching, he looked like a drifter passing through town, maybe looking for construction work or a place to lay low for a few days. But the careful observer might have noticed that his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging faces, exits, and potential threats with the automatic precision of someone who had survived multiple combat deployments. Sarah was waiting for him at the bus station with 2 cups of coffee and a relief she couldn't quite hide. Jake had been her spotter during some of the most dangerous missions of her career, and if anyone could help her navigate this civilian nightmare, it was him. "Heard you were having some trouble with the local wildlife," Jake said quietly as they walked toward her apartment. "That's one way to put it," Sarah replied. "How much do you know?" "Enough. Rich boy thinks he can use his money and connections to force himself on a woman who just wants to be left alone. Classic predator behavior, except he picked the wrong prey. They spent the morning at Sarah's apartment while Jake gathered intelligence on Marcus Thompson. Using resources that were technically illegal for civilians to access, he quickly built a comprehensive profile of their target. Marcus Thompson, 34 years old, inherited his daddy's real estate empire when he was 25, Jake reported. Multiple allegations of sexual assault over the years, but no convictions. His father's money and connections made the problems disappear. 3 restraining orders filed against him in the past 5 years, all dismissed on technicalities. Sarah felt her anger building as Jake continued his briefing. The guy's a repeat offender who's never faced consequences for his actions. Gets worse, Jake continued. I did some digging into his business practices. He's been using the same playbook for years. Identify vulnerable women, usually newcomers to town without local connections, then use his influence to systematically destroy their lives until they submit to his demands. How many victims? Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. That I can identify? 7 in the past 3 years. Probably more who never came forward or who left town before I could trace them. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the full weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her anymore. Marcus Thompson was a serial predator who had been operating with impunity for years, destroying lives and facing no consequences because of his wealth and connections. What's the plan? Jake asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. In her former life, the plan would have been simple and permanent. Marcus Thompson would have simply disappeared one night, his body never found, his crimes ending forever. But this was civilian life with civilian rules and civilian consequences. We need evidence, she said finally. Enough to put him away permanently and expose the network that's been protecting him. Jake nodded. That's going to be tricky. He's smart enough to keep his hands clean legally. Most of his threats are verbal, and the people who could testify against him are too scared to come forward. Then we make him careless. Force him to escalate until he makes mistakes we can document. That's dangerous, Sarah. Using yourself as bait against a predator like this. I can handle myself. I know you can. But this isn't Afghanistan. You can't just eliminate the threat and move on. This is long-term psychological warfare, and guys like Thompson are experts at it. Sarah understood the risks, but she also knew that running wasn't an option anymore. Marcus Thompson had made this personal when he invaded her home, threatened her safety, and made it clear that he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. More importantly, knowing about his other victims made it impossible for her to simply disappear and leave him free to continue his pattern of abuse. That evening, Sarah returned to work at Murphy's Diner as if nothing had changed. But now she was no longer playing defense. Every interaction with Marcus, every threat he made, every display of his power would be carefully documented and preserved. Jake was positioned in a rented car across the street, recording everything with high-quality surveillance equipment. Marcus arrived during her shift, as she had expected. But this time, Sarah was ready for him. Evening, sweetheart, Marcus said, sliding into his usual booth. Have you thought about what we discussed? I have, Sarah replied, setting down his coffee with steady hands. And I think you're right. I could use a friend in this town. Marcus's smile was triumphant and predatory. I knew you'd come around. Smart girls always do. But I need to know what kind of friend you're going to be, Sarah continued, activating the small recording device hidden in her apron. I mean, you're asking me to trust you with a lot. What do you want to know? Well, you said you have connections everywhere. The sheriff, the bank, local businesses. How do I know you'll use those connections to help me instead of hurt me? Marcus leaned back in his booth, clearly enjoying the opportunity to boast about his power. Sweetheart, I own this town. Sheriff Peterson does what I tell him because I funded his last 3 campaigns. The bank manager approves the loans I want approved because I'm their biggest depositor. Half the city council owes me favors, and the other half owes me money. That's impressive, Sarah said, making sure to speak clearly for the recording device. But what about people who don't want to play along? What happens to them? Well, that depends on how stubborn they are, Marcus replied, his voice taking on a darker tone. Most people are smart enough to see reason when they understand what's at stake. But the ones who aren't, well, let's just say life can get very difficult very quickly for people who don't have friends in the right places. Difficult how? Marcus's eyes glittered with malicious pleasure. Oh, there's so many ways. Bank loans get called in early. Health inspectors find violations at people's businesses. The fire department discovers safety issues that require expensive corrections. Sometimes people even find themselves facing criminal charges for things they didn't do. Sarah felt sick listening to him describe the systematic corruption he used to control people's lives. But she forced herself to continue the conversation, knowing that every word was being recorded. That sounds terrible, she said. What about that girl who worked at the hardware store last year? Jenny something. Marcus's smile turned cruel. Jenny Morrison. She thought she could file a complaint against me with some state agency. Turns out her boyfriend had a drug problem nobody knew about. Funny how the police found his stash during a routine traffic stop. Jenny left town pretty quick after that, especially once she realized that fighting me meant fighting the whole system. Sarah's blood ran cold. Marcus was confessing to framing innocent people, destroying lives, and corrupting law enforcement. But more than that, he was enjoying it. This wasn't just about power or control. He genuinely took pleasure in hurting people who couldn't fight back. You're very thorough, Sarah said. I have to be. Can't let people think they can cross Marcus Thompson and get away with it. Bad for business, bad for my reputation. People need to understand that when I want something, I get it, one way or another. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus becoming increasingly explicit about his methods, and increasingly confident that Sarah was just another victim who had accepted her fate. By the time he left, Sarah had recorded enough material to destroy him. If she could find someone in law enforcement who wasn't corrupt. Jake met her after her shift ended, his expression grim. I got everything. Audio, video, enough evidence to put him away for years. But there's a problem. Let me guess. Local law enforcement is compromised. Worse than that. I did some digging while you were getting his confession. Sheriff Peterson isn't just taking campaign contributions from Thompson. He's been actively participating in the cover-ups. At least 3 cases where evidence disappeared or witnesses were intimidated into silence. Sarah felt a familiar weight settling in her chest. They had evidence of Marcus Thompson's crimes, but no legitimate authority to present it to. In a corrupt system, the truth was worthless unless you could find someone with the power and integrity to act on it. So what are our options? She asked. We could try the state police, but Thompson's family has connections there too. FBI might be interested, but they're not going to open an investigation based solely on recorded confessions about local corruption. We need more. Like what? Like catching him in the act of something federal. Or finding evidence of crimes serious enough that even his connections can't make them disappear. Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking through the implications. He's escalating. Tonight proved that. He's getting more confident, more open about what he's willing to do. Sooner or later, he's going to cross a line that even his corrupt friends can't protect him from. The question is whether you're willing to wait that long, and whether you can survive what he might do in the meantime. As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Hope you enjoyed our talk tonight. Looking forward to our dinner tomorrow. Don't keep me waiting. He's not going to give me a choice, Sarah said, showing Jake the message. He thinks I've agreed to his demands, and he's going to expect me to follow through. Jake studied her face in the dim light of the parking lot. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Marcus Thompson has been hunting vulnerable women for years, using the system to protect himself while he destroys lives. Maybe it's time someone taught him what it feels like to be the prey instead of the predator. Sarah, this isn't a military operation. You can't just eliminate the target and disappear. I'm not talking about elimination. I'm talking about justice. Real justice. The kind that ensures he never hurts anyone again. Jake was quiet for a long moment. What do you need me to do? Sarah looked at her friend, and former teammate, grateful once again for the bonds forged in combat that never truly faded. Help me plan something that Marcus Thompson will never see coming. Something that will expose him and everyone who's been protecting him. And if things go wrong? Sarah's smile was cold and predatory, the expression of someone who had spent years being the most dangerous person in the room. Then, Marcus Thompson is going to learn why you should never corner a Navy SEAL. Some of us don't know how to surrender. As they walked through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, Sarah felt a familiar calm settling over her. The scared civilian was gone completely now, replaced by the warrior she had always been underneath. Marcus Thompson thought he was playing a game where he held all the cards. He was about to discover that he had actually declared war on someone who was very, very good at winning wars. Sarah's phone rang at exactly 6 in the morning. She had been awake for hours, going through equipment checks and final preparations for what was about to unfold. Marcus's voice was cheerful and confident, the tone of a man who believed he had won. "Good morning, sweetheart. I hope you're ready for our dinner date tonight. I've made reservations at my house for 8 o'clock. Don't be late." "Where do you live?" Sarah asked, playing her part perfectly. Marcus gave her directions to an estate on the outskirts of town, a sprawling property that his family had owned for generations. Sarah wrote down the address, knowing that Jake was already conducting surveillance on the location. "And Sarah, dress nice. I want you to look your best for me." The line went dead, and Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Marcus Thompson was about to walk into the most carefully planned trap of his life, and he had no idea it was coming. Jake returned from his reconnaissance mission with detailed intelligence on Thompson's estate. Big house, lots of open ground, multiple access points. But there's a problem: private security. 2 guards, probably armed, patrolling the perimeter. Professional security or local guys looking to make easy money? Sarah asked. Hard to tell from distance, but they're carrying themselves like professionals. Disciplined patrol patterns, good situational awareness. This isn't Thompson's first time bringing reluctant dinner guests to his house. Sarah felt her blood run cold. You think he's done this before? I think Marcus Thompson has been very careful to create a private space where he can do whatever he wants without witnesses. The question is whether we're walking into a rape or a murder. Or both, Sarah said grimly. They spent the afternoon finalizing their plan. Sarah would go to the dinner as expected, wearing surveillance equipment that would record everything that happened. Jake would be positioned outside with backup communication gear and enough firepower to handle the security team if things went wrong. Remember, Jake said as they went over the plan one final time, we need him to incriminate himself completely before we make our move. Half measures won't work against someone with his connections. Understand the mission parameters, Sarah replied, falling back into the formal language they had used during their military service. What about extraction if things go sideways? I'll be monitoring from 3 positions around the property. If you need immediate extraction, activate the emergency beacon and I'll come in hard and fast. But Sarah, Jake paused, his expression serious. If this goes wrong, if he tries to hurt you, don't hesitate to use whatever force is necessary. Civilian rules don't apply when your life is in danger. Sarah nodded, understanding the unspoken permission he was giving her. If Marcus Thompson crossed certain lines, she was authorized to respond with the full extent of her training, regardless of the legal consequences. That evening, Sarah dressed carefully for dinner. She chose a simple black dress that looked elegant, but allowed for full range of movement if combat became necessary. The surveillance equipment was hidden so skillfully that even a professional search would have trouble finding it. In her purse, she carried items that looked innocent, but could become weapons in the right hands. Marcus Thompson's estate was everything she had expected, ostentatious, isolated, and designed to intimidate visitors. The main house was a massive Georgian colonial surrounded by perfectly manicured grounds. Security lights illuminated the driveway and main entrance, but Sarah noted that much of the property remained in shadow. Good for Jake's infiltration, but also good for concealing activities that the owner didn't want observed. A security guard met her at the front gate, checking her identification against a list before allowing her to proceed to the main house. Sarah memorized his face, his equipment, and his position as she drove up the long driveway. Marcus greeted her at the front door, dressed in an expensive suit and wearing the confident smile of a man who believed he was about to get everything he wanted. "Sarah, you look absolutely beautiful. Please come in." The interior of the house was as intimidating as the exterior. High ceilings, expensive artwork, and an atmosphere that spoke of old money and older secrets. Marcus led her to a formal dining room where a table was set for two, complete with candles and an expensive bottle of wine. "I hope you're hungry," Marcus said, pulling out her chair with exaggerated courtesy. "My chef prepared something special for tonight." Sarah allowed him to seat her while her eyes swept the room, cataloging exits, potential weapons, and the location of security cameras. She noticed that the cameras were positioned to monitor the entrances, but not the dining area itself. Marcus clearly valued his privacy during these encounters. "This is quite a place," Sarah said, accepting the glass of wine he offered. "It must be nice having so much space to yourself." "Oh, I don't just use it for myself," Marcus replied, his smile taking on a predatory edge. "I often entertain guests here, especially guests who need to learn about the way things work in my town." Sarah took a small sip of wine while activating the recording device hidden in her bracelet. "What kind of lessons do you teach?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the opportunity to boast about his power. "Well, it depends on the student. Some people learn quickly that cooperation brings rewards. Others require more intensive instruction." "What kind of intensive instruction?" The question hung in the air as Marcus studied her face, perhaps wondering how much he could safely reveal. But his arrogance won out over his caution, as Sarah had known it would. "Let me put it this way, sweetheart. This house is very private, very soundproof. My security team is very loyal and very well paid to forget what they see and hear. People who come here for dinner often leave with a much better understanding of their place in the world." Sarah felt her skin crawl, but she forced herself to continue the conversation. "How many people have you brought here for these lessons?" "Over the years, more than a dozen. Some were more cooperative than others, but in the end, they all learned what they needed to learn." Sarah's training kept her face neutral, but inside she was fighting waves of rage and revulsion. Marcus Thompson wasn't just a predator. He was a serial rapist who had been using his isolated estate to assault women for years, protected by corrupt law enforcement and intimidated victims who were too scared to come forward. "What happened to the ones who weren't cooperative?" she asked. Marcus's smile turned cold. "That's not really your concern, sweetheart. Your concern is making sure you're very, very cooperative tonight." The threat was clear, and Sarah knew they had reached the moment of truth. Marcus Thompson had just confessed to multiple sexual assaults, implied that some of his victims had been murdered, and made it clear that he intended to assault her as well. The recording device had captured every word. "Marcus," Sarah said quietly, "I need to tell you something." "What's that, sweetheart?" Sarah looked directly into his eyes, her voice calm and controlled. "My name isn't really Sarah Martinez, and I'm not really a waitress." Marcus's expression shifted slightly, confusion beginning to replace confidence. "What are you talking about?" "I'm Petty Officer First Class Sarah Elena Rodriguez, United States Navy SEALs. Serial number 584-7392. And you've just confessed to enough federal crimes to put you in prison for the rest of your life." For a moment, Marcus stared at her in complete silence, his brain struggling to process what she had just said. Then his face twisted with rage, and he lunged across the table toward her. Sarah was ready for him. Her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist, applying pressure to nerve points that dropped him to his knees instantly. Her other hand retrieved a small device from her purse and activated it, sending a signal to Jake that the operation had moved to the next phase. "You lying bitch," Marcus gasped, trying to pull free from her grip. "Do you have any idea who I am? What I can do to you?" "I know exactly who you are," Sarah replied, her voice deadly calm. You're a serial rapist who uses wealth and corruption to prey on innocent women. But more importantly, you're about to find out who I am." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the house as Marcus's security team responded to what they probably thought was a domestic disturbance. Sarah released his wrist and stepped back, positioning herself where she could engage multiple targets if necessary. Two armed guards burst into the dining room, weapons drawn, expecting to find their boss in control of the situation. Instead, they found a woman standing calmly beside Marcus Thompson, who was clutching his wrist and looking like he had seen a ghost. "Sir, is everything all right?" one of the guards asked. "She's some kind of cop," Marcus snarled, struggling to his feet. "Arrest her. Do whatever you have to do, but handle the situation." The guards looked uncertain. They had signed up to patrol a rich man's property, not to assault federal law enforcement officers. But they were being paid very well to follow orders without asking questions. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us," the lead guard said, raising his weapon. Sarah raised her hand slowly, appearing to surrender. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." "Why not?" the guard asked. Sarah's smile was cold and predatory. "Because you're surrounded." As if on cue, the house's lights went out, plunging the dining room into darkness. In the chaos that followed, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of flashbang grenades detonating throughout the house, followed by the controlled explosions Jake was using to breach the building through multiple entry points. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting eerie shadows as armed figures in tactical gear swept through the house with military precision. Marcus's security team, disoriented and outgunned, surrendered immediately when they realized they were facing professional soldiers rather than local police. "Clear!" Jake's voice echoed through the house as his team secured the premises. Marcus Thompson stood in the middle of his dining room, surrounded by elite operators who moved with the deadly efficiency of people who had spent years fighting America's enemies overseas. His world of corruption and privilege had just collided with a level of professional violence he couldn't comprehend. "Marcus Thompson," Sarah said formally, "you are under arrest for multiple violations of federal law, including human trafficking, sexual assault, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. You have the right to remain silent." As she read him his rights, Sarah felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. Marcus Thompson's reign of terror was over. His victims would finally have their day in court, and he was about to learn that some prey fought back harder than predators ever expected. The hunter had become the hunted, and the hunt was finally over. The federal courthouse in the state capitol was packed on the morning of Marcus Thompson's sentencing. Representatives from the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service filled the gallery alongside journalists, victims' advocates, and family members of Thompson's many victims. Sarah sat in the front row, wearing her dress blue Navy uniform for the first time in over a year. The ribbons and medals on her chest told the story of a distinguished military career, Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts, and commendations that spoke of courage under fire and service to her country. Today, she wore them not as decorations, but as armor against the final confrontation with the man who had tried to destroy her life. The investigation that followed Thompson's arrest had been swift and thorough. Jake's team had included federal agents operating under deep cover, and the surveillance equipment they had used was military-grade technology that captured everything in perfect detail. Thompson's confession had been just the beginning. Once the FBI took over the case, they had found evidence of a criminal conspiracy that went far beyond one wealthy man's predatory behavior. Thompson's estate had been the center of a human trafficking operation that had been running for over a decade. Young women, many of them immigrants or runaways, had been brought to the property under false pretenses and held against their will. The basement of Thompson's mansion contained rooms that had clearly been designed for imprisonment. Soundproof walls, reinforced doors, and security systems that kept people in rather than keeping intruders out. DNA evidence found in those rooms told a story of systematic abuse that made even hardened federal investigators sick to their stomachs. Sheriff Peterson had been arrested along with 3 of his deputies, charged with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accepting bribes. The corruption in Cedar Falls ran deep, involving judges, prosecutors, and local officials who had taken Thompson's money in exchange for looking the other way while he preyed on innocent people. But perhaps most importantly, the investigation had led to the identification of 17 women who had been victims of Thompson's crimes over the years. Some had been too terrified to come forward before, convinced that the system would protect Thompson rather than seek justice for them. Others had tried to report his crimes and been silenced by corrupt officials who made their complaints disappear. Now, all 17 victims had the opportunity to face their attacker in court and tell their stories to a jury that actually cared about justice. The trial had lasted 3 weeks, with testimony that painted a picture of systematic abuse, corruption, and criminal conspiracy. Thompson's defense attorneys had tried every legal trick they could think of, challenging the admissibility of evidence, questioning the credibility of witnesses, and arguing that their client was the victim of an elaborate setup. But the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings Sarah had made were just the beginning. Federal investigators had found financial records showing payments to corrupt officials, communications detailing the cover-up of previous crimes, and physical evidence from Thompson's estate that proved beyond any doubt that serious federal crimes had been committed there. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 43 counts, including human trafficking, sexual assault, conspiracy, and racketeering. Under federal sentencing guidelines, Thompson was facing life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, as Judge Catherine Morrison prepared to announce the sentence, Sarah reflected on the long journey that had brought them all to this moment. What had started as a simple desire for a peaceful civilian life had become something much larger, a fight for justice that had exposed an entire network of corruption and abuse. Mr. Thompson, Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. In 30 years on the federal bench, I have rarely seen crimes as systematic, as calculated, and as utterly devoid of human decency as those you have committed. Thompson stood at the defense table, his expensive suits replaced by an orange prison jumpsuit, his arrogant confidence completely gone. The man who had once terrorized women with his power and connections now looked small and defeated, finally, facing consequences he couldn't buy his way out of. You used your wealth, your family's reputation, and your connections in law enforcement to create a criminal enterprise designed to prey on vulnerable women. The judge continued. You turned your family estate into a prison where you could assault, torture, and terrorize victims who had no way to escape or seek help. Sarah watched Thompson's face as the judge spoke, looking for any sign of remorse or acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. She saw none. Even now, facing life in prison, Marcus Thompson seemed to believe that he was the victim of some cosmic injustice rather than the architect of his own destruction. The evidence presented at trial shows that you were responsible for destroying the lives of at least 17 women, and potentially many more whose stories we may never know, Judge Morrison said. Your crimes represent not just individual acts of violence, but a systematic corruption of the institutions that are supposed to protect the innocent and pursue justice. The judge paused, looking directly at Thompson with undisguised contempt. You have shown no remorse for your crimes, no acknowledgement of the suffering you have caused, and no indication that you would behave differently if given the opportunity. In fact, the pre-sentencing investigation suggests that you view yourself as the victim in this case, wrongly persecuted by a system that has finally held you accountable for your actions. Sarah felt a deep satisfaction as she watched Thompson squirm under the judge's withering assessment. This was what justice looked like, not the quick violence that would have ended his threat immediately, but the slow, methodical process of exposing his crimes to the light and ensuring that he could never hurt anyone again. Therefore, Judge Morrison announced, On the charges of human trafficking, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. On the charges of sexual assault, I sentence you to 25 years to run consecutively. On the charges of conspiracy and racketeering, I sentence you to 15 years to run consecutively. The gallery erupted in applause as Thompson's legs buckled, and he had to grab the defense table to keep from falling. His attorneys looked shell-shocked, having clearly hoped for a more lenient sentence despite the overwhelming evidence against their client. Furthermore, the judge continued, raising her voice over the noise in the courtroom. I am ordering the forfeiture of all assets connected to these crimes, including the Thompson family estate, all business holdings, and financial accounts. These assets will be liquidated and the proceeds used to compensate the victims and fund programs to combat human trafficking. Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks as she watched justice finally being served. The man who had thought he was untouchable was being destroyed as completely as he had destroyed his victims. His wealth, his power, his connections, all of it was being stripped away, leaving him with nothing but a prison cell and the weight of his crimes. As Thompson was led away in shackles, he turned and looked directly at Sarah. For a moment, their eyes met across the courtroom, and she saw in his face the final recognition of what had happened to him. He had hunted what he thought was helpless prey, only to discover that he had actually cornered a predator far more dangerous than himself. After the sentencing, Sarah stood outside the courthouse and spoke to the assembled media. She had requested this opportunity not to celebrate Thompson's downfall, but to send a message to other predators who might be watching. Marcus Thompson thought he could use his wealth and connections to prey on innocent people, Sarah said, her voice clear and strong. He thought that being rich and well-connected made him untouchable. He was wrong. She paused, looking directly into the cameras that were broadcasting her words across the country. There are other Marcus Thompsons out there in small towns and big cities using their power to hurt people who can't fight back. I want them to know that they're not as safe as they think they are. Justice may be slow, but it's patient and it's thorough and it never gives up. Sarah thought about the other victims she had met during the trial, brave women who had found the courage to tell their stories and face their attacker in court. Many of them were just beginning the long process of healing from what Thompson had done to them, but they all shared a sense of closure that came from seeing their attacker finally held accountable. To anyone out there who has been hurt by someone in power, someone who thinks they're untouchable, Sarah continued, don't give up hope. There are people fighting for you, people who won't let bullies and predators hide behind wealth or connections or corrupt systems. Justice may take time, but it will come. Later that evening, Sarah and Jake sat in a quiet bar near the courthouse, reflecting on the long journey that had brought them to this point. The media attention was beginning to fade, and soon Sarah would be able to return to something approaching a normal life. So what's next? Jake asked. Back to the diner? Sarah laughed, the first genuinely relaxed laugh she had experienced in months. I don't think so. Turns out Cedar Falls has a new sheriff, and he's offered me a job as a federal liaison. Help clean up the corruption that's left and make sure nothing like this happens again. You going to be a cop? I'm going to be whatever I need to be to make sure people like Marcus Thompson don't get away with hurting innocent people, Sarah replied. I spent years fighting enemies overseas. Maybe it's time I started fighting the ones here at home. Jake raised his beer in a toast. To Sarah Martinez, waitress turned federal crime fighter. Marcus Thompson picked the wrong woman to mess with. To all the women he hurt, Sarah corrected. They're the real heroes in this story. They found the courage to come forward, to face their attacker, to demand justice even when the system was rigged against them. As they drank to the courage of survivors and the power of justice, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. She tried to leave her warrior identity behind, to become just another civilian looking for a quiet life. But Marcus Thompson had reminded her that there were battles worth fighting everywhere, and that sometimes the most important victories were won in courtrooms rather than battlefields. The predator who had thought he was untouchable was now facing life in a federal prison, his criminal empire destroyed, his victims finally vindicated. And Sarah Martinez, the quiet waitress who had just wanted to be left alone, had proven once again that some people should never be underestimated. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, and justice had finally completely been served.